Okay. I propose that we start back with this second roundtable about modeling the observation of the interstellar medium. So I'm Jean Petit, and I will co-animate this discussion with
Nathalie Izard.
Okay. So we will, it will be similar to the first roundtables. So we prepared some questions that we will ask to the different people who gave lecture on this subject. Sylvie Cabri is not yet there. Maybe she will join. Let's see.
And don't hesitate to ask questions on the Slack channel, because we will watch what you are writing and ask the questions to the participants. Okay.
Okay. So I will share my screen. To show the questions. Okay. So on the roundtables, we have Émeric Bron, Véronique Bouya, Sylvie Cabri, Karine Demick, and Gary Ferland. And we'll start with this first round of questions. And in particular about the fact that for ESM studies, interstellar medium studies, and even more if you're looking at galaxies and redshift galaxies, we can do only remote sensing. So we don't have the ground truth that we would have, for instance, if we were observing the Earth with satellites. Here it's only remote sensing. And so there are a number of questions that comes with this. And I will start with the first. I propose that we start the questions with the first one. So when we are modeling, how do we know that we achieve the truth? And are there, and if yes, which observation can discriminate some physical and or chemical processes? So whoever who want to start? It's a difficult question. So Carrie.
No, I don't know.
So you call me?
Gary,
right?
Gary.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know how to answer this question right here. I do know how other fields are answering this question. So I became interested in dense plasmas and then became interested in the dense plasma community. And so what they have, tokamaks, magnetic fusion, ITER, jet, that kind of thing. And there's many billions of euros that have gone into a machine, and they can't touch the plasma either. And so they have to do spectroscopy, indirect spectroscopy, and then computational modeling to understand what goes on in ITER. And there they built the machine or jet, and there's many more magnetic there's fusion. And in the dark edges of it, it gets into bomb research because it's very serious business, very big money, and they're up against the same problems. So what there is if you look at what they set up at ITER, what they set up at the large labs here in the States, there are labs where the people who have the experiments, where they have an idea what they did. Unfortunately, magnetic fields are very important there, and it's just as bad as magnetic fields in astronomy. And then they also support a very active set of meetings in the controlled fusion, magnetic fusion community. There's one meeting per year, alternating years between Europe and United States, which go into the modeling, try to do different models to try to get good models of what's going on in the plasma. And the way one person put it, there are these agencies paying us an awful lot of money to develop theoretical models of what's going on in their plasma. We better get the right answer. And what they have is about 20 or so codes that can do this. It's a big community. There are lots, there are aspects of it they can't talk about because it's maybe uncontrolled fusion, but the controlled fusion part, ITER, that kind of thing, is out in the open. And the community gets together and talk about why the codes don't agree. There was a time, so there's a lot here. What you'll find is that if you get into chemistry predictions or PDR predictions, the codes don't agree at all. And so why would you trust a code if they don't agree with one another? That's the first question. That's something we can control. In the ionized gas plasma, ionized gas is much easier than molecular gas because the time scales are so much faster. And it's very likely that an ionized gas is time steady. Daniel Pecquigno organized a meeting in Madone in 1986, I believe, to bring together all the people who could model ionized plasmas. There are about 20 of us, 20 different groups, 20 different codes back then. Now there's only about 3, maybe, codes left. Most of the other codes have gone away. And there hasn't been a meeting to try to look at this carefully and look at how the plasma codes agree in a long time. In the case of PDRs, there was a meeting in Leiden that I believe was organized by Matt Schock and Black in about 2006, I believe. It was more than 10 years ago. And there was a paper, Raleigh et al., which came out, which compared predictions. And what came of that was very troubling. If you turn off the temperature solver, if you assume that all PDRs have the same temperature, the disagreement was not catastrophic. But as soon as you turned on the temperature solvers and let the codes try to determine the gas temperature, the answer is really dispersed. That's not, the people who are doing it are very careful and they're trying their best. The chemistry and getting into these processes is very difficult. So there's several parts to the question. First of all, what is the physics you're trying to capture? What is the process? So if you get a given chemical reaction, you may, for instance, be using UMIST. UMIST is kind of a guess. Maybe it's an order of magnitude guess. If you Gargi Shah, who's worked with me in the past, is updating our version of the chemistry now with updates, and you find just minor changes in chemistry change predictions by very large factors. So there's a lot of feedback in the chemistry. So there's several aspects of it. What's the physics you're trying to capture? What exactly are the physical processes? Secondly, what are the rates that you use for this? And what's the uncertainty in the rates? And how does that trickle down into predictions? So we have a Monte Carlo noise generator in Cloudy. So you can turn it on. If you just run Cloudy again and again and again, you'll get the data changed by this noise estimator. You can see how the predictions change. So some rates don't matter much at all. So don't worry about those. You got to find the rates that really matter a lot. And then perhaps you could even guide experimentalists to go out and measure the rates if it's a chemical that doesn't blow up. Many of the chemicals we deal with in a lab are dangerous. If they don't want to, a chemist doesn't want to deal with them. molecular hydrogen blows up. It's flammable. But so that you can try to isolate the hot reactions and try to get better rates for them. But then finally, there are just lots of bugs in the codes. It's written by people. People are trying to do a good job. In the case of when the case where human life is at stake, maybe you're flying an airplane, you know, the computer control of airplanes or spacecraft, what they frequently will do have 2 or 3 different computer codes written by different groups, all trying to assess how to control the airplane, and they take a vote. I mean, in particular on the space shuttle, they had 5 computers, and they had a fat last computer that looked at all the answers the different computers got and how to control the shuttle, and then they decided, took a vote to figure out what to do next. So you can get multiple codes that way that are basically independent efforts, and then try to figure out why they don't agree. They won't. And there's the last part is just human error. And try to what you want to distill that, you know, Aristotle said there's the accidental problems and the essential problems. The accidental problems are things we can deal with, and that's the things like a bug in your code or limitations on CPU power. Then there's the essential difficulty, and that is, what are the rates for this? What are the unknown reactions that aren't included right now? So there's ways to tackle it. It would take a concerted effort, which I don't think happens in it. We don't organize ourselves in astronomy. You can't get a national, at least in this country, you can't get a national lab approach to trying to get the resources together and get everybody agreeing we're going to try to get this problem solved. It's much more, I'm an individual college professor all by myself. I'm doing my own thing. So that's how it works here. So the closest thing in the last 20 years was that Lorentz Center workshop in Leiden. And so if you want to, you could imagine some mega Lorentz Center workshop, you would have to have, you know, a fair budget attached to it. There's a lot of kind of secretarial work associated with all of this. You have to get somebody who's going to simulate all the observations and databases and get all the different code predictions and then figure out how there's a lot of data manipulation, and it would take a lot of organization, but something can be done.
So in fact, I think that you said two different things. The first one is that we need consistency between different modeling. It's important not to have one modeling, and then check the consistency between models.
Sure. I mean, the first thing you can do, we can control here on the Earth, is get the codes to agree.
Yeah.
So I would recommend
the codes do agree, exactly. So
sorry, they don't. No, they. I mean, the Raleigh et al. Paper in 2007, I think, 8A, sends a powerful message.
And the second part of what you said is whether the code we are using can be benchmarked on some either analytical solutions or on some experiments, laboratory experiments.
Well, you try that, but you might do OMC1, for instance, or the Orion PDR. Those have been super well studied, and we have, you know, even the magnetic field. So you could take a well-known astronomical object and try to understand what's wrong. But in the case, but so we can't build the plasma like they can in magnetic fusion.
No, I agree. But maybe there are other fields for which, or other phenomena for which, for instance, in PDR, maybe Emric or...
Sure. Yeah, you try to isolate the simplest astronomical system you can imagine that has no perturbations. It's just, you know, very dull, boring PDR, a very dull, boring H2 region, and then try to see.
Observational benchmark is also an important.
Well, that's the ground truth. The observations are the ground truth. And then our implementations here on the Earth are the chemistry networks that go into it, and the implementation into the solvers that go in the codes.
Emric?
Yes, maybe one point I wanted to add about this. I think, yes, indeed, this is very important. This is how can we estimate the reliability of the models? And indeed, there are two aspects. One is consistency between different independent models, and the other is assessing the impact of known uncertainties. For instance, we know that the chemical rates or various microphysical and chemical data, we know that it's known within some uncertainties, and we can estimate the impact of those uncertainties on the predictions of the models. But I think there is one other, maybe it's a complementary view on this question, is that of course we can never prove that a theory or a model is true, but we can prove that it's wrong if we find observations that contradict it. And one important question is in the way people use models, is to use models in a way that can prove the model wrong. If I can give a very simplified example, if you have a model that depends only on 2-3 parameters, and you are comparing it to observations of only 2 lines, unless your model is very degenerate, it's very likely that it will always be able to explain the observations, but then you haven't tested whether the model is correct or not. So it's also very important that in the way we confront models to observation, we confront it always with significantly more observational constraints than there are 3 parameters in the model.
Okay, Sylvie? You're muted, Sylvie.
Yes, unmute. Yeah, I fully agree with what was said before and what Emeric said. And it's actually something that is not often reported in model predictions, and maybe some extra work, because it requires a lot of extra work, which is to put error bars on model predictions. So maybe now with the neural networks and artificial intelligence, it's going to be much easier to do that, to actually try to explore, when you give error bars on the different processes, maybe you can actually get an error bar on the predictions. It's not very easy, because otherwise manually it's impossible to do. But I feel it would be very, very useful to do that, because my experience is that observers overestimate the precision of the models or the reliability of the models, and modelers overestimate the reliability of observations, but both have error bars. Something else about the second point, which observations can discriminate physical and chemical processes, which is a very important question, of course. And in terms of the shocks, I have found that velocity information is crucial. I mean, we often, if we just reason on integrated line fluxes, it's also can be quite degenerate, and because there is always an uncertainty on the chemistry, you can always say, well, maybe if I do more irradiation, or if I just do a little bit on the ices and this and that, I can explain it. But if you have the velocity information, and in particular, if you see broad lines, the thing has to be dynamical. If it's supersonic, it's supersonic. And there's got to be some shock somewhere. So
you're saying that basically this is a strong discriminant of shocks, and you spoke also about SIO and
yes, SIO, but also like CH+, for example, which has we know it has to be irradiated medium, but if the lines are very broad, it cannot be a PDR, it has to be a shock, for example. Or I was just looking yesterday for the hands-on at a paper that we made with Hexos data on Orion South. It was a survey, a spectral survey with Herschel of Orion South, and they were comparing to Orion KL, and they were trying to see how the chemistry was different But in fact, if you just lump everything together, it's not clear. But if you actually look at the line profiles and you see that there are two components in the line profile, narrow component, and there are actually three components in the line profiles. And each of these components you can fit separately with a different temperature, a different line width, and different abundances. So if you didn't have the velocity, and one of them is a quiescent medium, one of them is a PDR, and one of them is a shock.
Okay. I will give the micro to Gary who raises hands, but I would like that Karine and Véronique think about discriminants for dust, for instance, whether those exist.
I just want to make a really quick comment. There's the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. So you can make an estimate of the uncertainties in the code by looking at the uncertainties and the rates we're including. Historically, in what I've worked on, mainly ionized gas, that's not really been the big problem. The big problem is there's some major reaction we just didn't know about. The best example of this is dielectronic recombination in ionized gas. So for the whole decade of 60s, people trying to model ionized gas were wasting their time because they were leaving out the dominant process. And then Mike Seaton, about 1980, realized what was happening, and I think there was a revolution. But there was no analysis of uncertainties and known rates would have picked up the unknown unknowns.
Thank you, Gary. So, Karine or Véronique, about dust.
About dust, I would say that to discriminate or to know precisely dust properties, what you need is as many observations as possible over the widest spectral range. Emission only, for example, is not enough. It can tell you that you have coagulation of dust grain, but it will not allow you to constrain the structure and the composition. For this, basically, and for a lot of to characterize the evolution of dust properties and structures and composition, you need spectroscopic observation with the highest possible angular and spectral resolution to be able to see fine details of the vibration.
In order to lift the degeneracy that
you
get from continuum.
Yeah, exactly. And to see the evolution of this dust component, the evolution of ICs, for example, the evolution of the carbonaceous matter also, which is quite complicated. And you need this in many environments if you want to build a scenario of evolution of this dust.
Véronique, do you want to comment?
Yes, when you are working on galaxies, after the introduction of Karine about dust, you don't have all this data for sure. Even the emission, most of the time you have only few data, and especially if you are working at intermediate redshift or on large samples of galaxies. So, we know that we cannot achieve truth for sure. So we have to decide what we want to do and what we are able to measure. Even the dust mass and the evolution of dust mass from galaxies nearby universe up to the high redshift is difficult because from the dust emission it's difficult to fit it because you don't have the data for that. So the models must be simple. The problem, as I see it, is how can we simplify model to continue to be realistic and not to be completely wrong or to forget something very important. I think it's something difficult, and we also discussed the uncertainties on models, and I think it's something very important because it's very difficult. I'm not developing models for dust models, but I am using models, and sometimes it's difficult to understand which error you have. And for example, if you use one dust model or another one and then you put it in radiation transfer modeling, and very complex post-processing. Well, at the end, you don't know what is the impact of the dust model, and it's difficult to compare models and to get a realistic error bar on what you can do or what you can understand from the few data you have on galaxies.
But, yeah, that's a good point. And in fact, the ingredients of cosmic dust model, the optical constant or the opacity that are measured in the lab or calculated, usually they are not given with any error bars.
Voilà. Donc,
Although we have some error bars. When we do some measuring, we know that things are not perfect, and so we could deliver some uncertainty. And this then should be
wait a minute,
propagated.
Sylvie, I think that Sylvie has her microphone on and trying to speak at the same time, you know? Okay, so can you, sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
So I should, yeah, did you hear what I said, or
Yes,
should I
yes,
repeat?
yes.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a really an important point, that all dust model should try to consider what is the uncertainty of their opacity, of the opacity they deliver, and how, so that you could be able to compare them better also.
Yeah, and for example, I'm working in UV. Well, I worked a lot on UV, and you have the problem of the albedo, and from a model to another one, you have very different results at the end, and very different configurations that you must assume to understand your data. And it's very difficult to have an idea of the precision you have on the models and what you can say from what can use them without saying something which is completely unrealistic or not motivated. So it's difficult.
so another thing is when we are modeling one observations, there are plenty of unknown, and so the question is whether we can consider those unknowns, the geometry or the mixing of stuff, as just noise, or it's impossible. Additional noise.
I think it's difficult because it changes the different configurations that you can have change completely the result. So it's more than noise. Well, if you consider that it is noise, you have error bars we cannot say anything. You must have a model for the geometrical configuration, and yeah. But most of the time, well, in the models I used, the dust models is fixed. You don't have any change on it, and you change all the other parameters that you don't know, but you try to different dense versus diffuse models, mixing, screen, and whatever you can try to use. But the dust model is fixed. And then if you want to change, well, it's not so easy. So you have to go to completely different models to change the dust model. But the dust model is just like the IMF. So most of the time it's fixed in the models.
Emeric, do you want to comment on?
On your point of considering some unknowns as noise?
Yes.
I think this is something that can be done in some cases, but you can only really do it if you have an idea of a distribution for this unknown. For instance, it kind of comes back to what we were mentioning before, that if you know that some chemical rate is unknown, but we have an idea of an uncertainty range for it, then we can sample across this range and see what impact it has on the prediction. But if there is an unknown for which we don't even know, we can't even characterize a distribution, it's very difficult to include it as a source of noise in the model. So for effects such as geometry or stuff like that, it's quite difficult to even define a distribution that we could use as a source of noise.
Yeah, okay. Natalie, do we have questions already? You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. We don't have questions, but we have two comments. One from Kevin Harrington saying having larger systematic uncertainties helps to alleviate the observational imperfections. Sometimes we hope the errors are smaller than they really are. And Fred Galliano tells us about the model truth. Estimating the uncertainty of inferred parameters is the everyday of a modeler. It is, however, very difficult to estimate the true uncertainty of a model. What is the uncertainty induced by assuming a specific geometry or some particular microphysical properties? What we get is a model credibility, knowing a set of observations. The truth of a model, or rather its credibility, is the goal.
Yeah, instead of speaking about uncertainty or noise, there is a question of bias. You have one model, you have one reality that is complex, and you're trying to modelizing with a model that is simpler than the reality, and whether there is this is a bias. Anyone wants to comment on those?
Oh, yes, I think you are true. For when you use simple models, yes, so it's you must be cautious not to have bias, and it's very difficult to to check that you are not biased. Yes, so it's clear that for studies of galaxies and properties in general and dust properties, yes, it's clearly a problem to have assumptions which are not biased. Yes,
Sylvie?
I completely agree.
Yeah, I was actually had raised my hand because I was going to make the same comment as you just did, Jérôme. I think that rather than talking about additional sources of noise, it's really a bias, because it tends to be more of a systematic effect when you ignore some process, or when you don't model it well. The effect on the predictions is not just a Gaussian spreading. You cannot characterize it with an error bar. It's really a shift in one direction or another. And for example, and then this has effect on the inferred parameters. We have tried this again for shocks, going from 1D to 2D, going to, instead of planar shock, to bow shocks. Just a simple bow shock model, and we see already biases when you infer shock speed. For example, you underestimate the maximum shock speed, or if you infer the magnetic field, if you do the opposite, you infer the magnetic field fixing the shock speed, the maximum shock speed, and you also have a bias. So I think it's kind of possible to guess which way the bias goes if we know which process we're talking about. Then, of course, the unknown processes, nobody knows. So I think in that respect, it's again having an idea of the error bars or biases from known parameters can help us see if there is also something entirely missing, because if the observations are completely outside of the known uncertainties, the known error bars, the known biases, then it means we are missing a key ingredient.
Yeah, and so to follow up on this, is it a common experience for modelers to think that error bar given by astronomers, observers like me, are too small, or do you think that the error bars given by observers are okay?
In my experience, it has been that often the reported error bars only include one source of error and sometimes leave out some other sources of errors.
Do you have an example that would be clearer?
I had an example working on Herschel data where some lines were observed simultaneously by two of the instruments in Herschel, and the disagreement between the two instruments was larger than the reported error bars at first. Then we discussed, and it was corrected. But
maybe the observers tends to give the noise due to photons and not enough the error due to the calibrations.
Yeah.
Gary, you're muted, Gary.
I was going to say exactly that. So I have a lot of experience working with molecular hydrogen. The error bars will tell you the photon counting error, but not the calibration error. The photon counting error can be less than 1%. The calibration error can be factors of 2.
Okay, I propose that we move on the next topic. So, Nathalie?
Yes. So the next topic is about the comparison of models and observations. And the first point concerns the geometry. So we have two questions which are kind of the same, but one more for the local ISM and one more for faraway galaxies. So how to tackle mixing of different environments along the pencil beam line of sight in terms of mixture of the dust properties, of the density of the environment, and how to do this when you are looking at high Z galaxies. So who want to start?
Again, for the gas, I will repeat what I said in the previous slide, which is the velocity information is really key when you try to do that, I think. Because you will find, you can identify different, you can extract different components from their velocity shifts and also from their line ratios as a function of velocity. Otherwise, I think there's no hope. So for the dust, of course, it's more complicated, but yeah. For the gas, that would be my guess.
Okay, maybe Véronique can comment on that.
Yes, for sure it's complicated. Yes. Well, when you are working on galaxies, I think it's almost impossible because what you can do is to check the consistency of what you see with models with different environments, and sometimes you can exclude some geometries because it's completely inconsistent. For example, I think about some screen in front of stars, and well, it's clear that you need some mixing, for example. Sometimes, well, for some observations, it's clear, but well, that's all. It's very difficult to have a detailed description of the environment. And well, pencil beam line of sight, well, for galaxies, the beam is large most of the time. So, well, it is instructive to compare at the kiloparsec scale to different regions. So, for example, on complex objects, just like mergers or objects for which you don't have an homogeneous distribution of dust, stars, and but even in kiloparsec scale, you can get simple results and simple descriptions, but not detailed description for sure. So you can constrain some models, well, some aspects of models, but that's all. You cannot do more than that.
Okay. Someone want to add something? Sylvie, your hand is still raised. It's sorry. Okay, so the next question is how to compare models and observations. Is the statistical analysis of observations the only way forward? And what about observation benchmarks for ISM?
Sorry, I wanted to add something about the,
sorry, I didn't see
previous no, but I was thinking, but I think, yes, this problem of mixing is a very difficult one, and we have to be very careful because mixing of conditions can sometimes mimic the predictions of a simple model, but for completely different conditions. I can give one example, which is much simpler than the actual problems that we encounter, for instance, in extragalactic observations. But once we tried comparing the prediction of the line intensities predicted by a PDR model, so including a gradient in temperature and in density along the line of sight, and analyzing those synthetic observations with a 0D model, a Radex analysis. And we found that in some cases, it could be very dangerous to do that because you would get good agreement, but with but you would find physical conditions that would be very different from the actual density and temperature values that were present in the model. So I think it's very important when we think about those problems, both for mixing along the line of sight and mixing in extragalactic environment, to explore by creating synthetic observation of mixed environment, where we take model, we build synthetic observation of mixtures of contribution of a large number of models, and then we can test that our analysis methods are not biased by the fact that it's a mixture. And I think that's something very important to do.
Jérôme, I'm sorry, but I don't understand.
It's more a thought that I had. Having for this problem of geometry, having ratios of observables sometimes helps, and it's a bit like what Véronique spoke about, trying to get the attenuation curves from from the ratio of observation of galaxies and stuff like that. And the underlying assumption is that the bingham factor, the mixing properties are the same from one galaxy to the other. Do you want to comment on this, Véronique?
Well, I really don't know, because well, you have a lot of assumptions behind. So yes, it's difficult. When yes, you have a lot of you have studies comparing galaxies which are supposed to be identical, and you compare and you say at the end that well, everything is due to dust reddening. So in some cases, of course, it's justified. Well, when you have a gamma ray burst in a galaxy, so for sure the model is simple even for quasars. Well, for the Calzetti work, for example, it was a central starburst of galaxies, so you can expect an homogeneous stellar population. So, okay, but well, sometimes it is extended to large wavelength range or integrated galaxies, and well, for me, it's quite dangerous. So at the end, you have a result, and well, the result is interesting, but the interpretation of the result is difficult, because I think that we measure things which probably have, well, have some significance, but it's very difficult to select the model or to make a comparison which is meaningful with model. Is what Emmerich said. Well, the models account for some mixing, something, but we don't know if well, another configuration cannot give the same thing. So it's very difficult to, from my point of view, to interpret this well, observations and empirical results or phenomenological results as you want, but at the end with models, because what is the accuracy or the meaning of the models as compared to what we are observing is something difficult. Unless you are in very constrained case where you can have an idea of the intrinsic emission, and if you are working on the dust effects. But well, most of the time it's not the case. You have a mix of stars and composite intrinsic emission of stars, so it's very difficult to go back to the effect of dust only.
Yeah. Sylvie, you want to add something?
Yes, just to follow up on what Emmerich said about, I agree, it's a good idea to try to simulate mixing of different regions in complex environments. I think what we will find is that the result is biased, certainly biased, and what it's going to be some weighted average. Either dominated by, depending on the tracer. I think the bias will depend on the tracer, but there will be tracers that are more biased towards certain types of regions, depending on the filling factor of each region and also the mass in each region, in each phase, let's say. So doing this type of mixing models, yes, could help us to distinguish which is the best tracer for each phase. And I think that that would be, my guess, that you want to be able to use the best, the most selective tracer of shocks, the most selective tracer for PDRs, the most selective tracer for diffuse median, etc., etc.
That brings us to our point of having benchmark observation for the ISM in the end, no?
Maybe.
Yeah, and so do you think so the statistical analysis of observation will be the only way forward in the future to do this kind of things?
Oh, is this for me, the question?
For everybody, for you if you want.
Statistical analysis, what do you mean by that? Like PCA or?
Well, if we put, it can, okay, it can recover, we can put a lot of things in that, but so using a lot of observations, doing this kind of machine learning things, and everything that has been done in the last years, at least started to be done.
For me, if I can answer in short, I mean, I think it's a very good way forward, but there are also other way forwards, like using known regions in the galaxy that have been observed at high and low spatial resolution, and using that as templates for what we may look at icy galaxies in our beam, and from that trying to see if we can find, as I said, powerful, which one is the most selective tracer of each region.
Yeah, but Sylvie, you're saying this, but as an observer, it's difficult to find in the literature which tracers are the most selective of one kind of region. So this should be a discussion between observers and modelers. No?
I'm going to put in the chat, I don't know, a reference to a paper, this paper in ORION-S, Herschel observations, which I think is a good summary of, they detected many species in different lines, and they have a very nice summary of which type of region is traced by which species, and how they can disentangle the different types of regions. So I think that's one example of, I think, a very useful study. Is that okay if I put it in the chat?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Anyone want to add something?
Oh, no.
Okay, so well, the next point was about the possibility to lift the degeneracies coming from integration along the line of sight. I think we have already discussed that kind of during the previous minutes, so we can skip that. And the last point was about the possibility to turn on, turn off some parts of the physics and chemistry to understand its impact. And maybe this brings us back to the point of Veronique, who was saying that maybe models should be kept simple as much as possible to be compared to observations. So do we have a comment?
It depends to which observation what observation you're modeling. If you have a very detailed and very accurate observation, then you can do a very detailed physical modeling and chemical modeling. If you mixes everything, then yes, probably you should be simple and keep only the main physical and chemical processes that are important. But for that, you need to check which one are the most important, in fact, depending on the environment.
Yeah, this is what is difficult when you don't have a lot of data. Sometimes it's difficult to understand which parameter is crucial and which one is less. It's not so easy to get to simplify models, when you start with very complex code, for example, at the end to have something which is simplified because, well, for sure, as Emeric said, you cannot have too many free parameters with a few data at the end. But sometimes it's difficult, and then, well, not well. I feel it can be dangerous to oversimplify or to neglect some crucial parameter. And sometimes from the literature, and when you get into models, it's not so easy to understand what are the crucial parameters or not, and how to simplify.
But this could probably be done on ISM regions where you have a lot of details, and then you just lower your resolution to mimic distant observation, and then you can compare your results.
But you don't know if your ISM region is representative of what you are seeing when you have a whole galaxy with a different medium and at different redshifts with perhaps different conditions. And so, yeah.
Different dust properties. And different,
exactly. Yeah. Too many parameters.
But I think this is a very fundamental problem of unresolved observation, is that there is a lot of complexity hidden behind the mixing in the beam and too little observational constraints. So we will, at some point, in any case, we need some assumptions and a priori to deduce anything. Otherwise, it's very under constraint. And so sometimes we have to go with what we have, which might be galactic observations, assumption based on what we see in galactic environments.
Okay, maybe Jérôme, do we have a comment or question from the Slack?
Yes, there is a first comment by Frédéric Galliano that proposed to make a difference between observation in well, modeling of one object for which the exact geometry, the distance from the star to the clouds, the illumination angle, and so on will matter a lot, and the modelization of one GNC in a nearby galaxy for which there is a large number of stars and mixing, and in this case, the medium can be statistically described in terms of synthetic parameters, and then what needs to be determined are things like filling factor, mean clump densities, clump interclust contrast density. So simple questions, simpler than just trying to find the full distribution or stuff like that. Any comment on this?
So this amounts to simplifying the distribution of conditions that are present in a simpler analytical form that depends only on a few parameters. It's again a question of reducing the number of parameters.
Yeah. Yes, I agree with what you said,
Yes.
Jérôme. So for sure, yes, it could be well, it's very interesting way to work and to simplify. Yes, so exactly.
So another point by Desisu is, well, it's a question. He asked, how can we use for high redshift galaxy, how can we use the cosmological simulation? So it's not exactly modeling, but it still has some link in order, so to use the cosmological simulations to get detailed prescriptions to analyze the mixing of environments.
Well, I'm not an expert of numerical simulations, but well, it depends on the resolution you have, and on cosmological simulations, you don't have a lot of resolution on a single object. And in any case, the model is simple after that, because you have a post-processing with radiation transfer modeling, but which is linked to the gas particles to which you put dust into gas particles. And then you use the radiation transfer models, but well, you have a lot of assumption behind. You again, dust models and the prescriptions of your radiation transfer code. So yes, it is interesting because you explore different geometries and perhaps densities of gas and dust, which could be different. But for me, the results are statistical, not for individual. You can have trends, and then what people are doing is they use for cosmological simulations, not for simulation for a single object, for example, for a galaxy where you have more information on the distribution of. But when you have a cosmological simulation, they have this morphology, which is resolution, which is not that good. And at the end, what they are doing when they have the result, they fit a very simple law, for example, an attenuation law, to get for example, the steepness of the law as compared to SMC or LMC law, or well, very simple parameters or results at the end are obtained from these simulations because the resolution is not there, and the models are simple, and the results are model dependent. So it is interesting because at the end we confirm other trends, and well, it's what I try to show during my lectures. Things appear to be consistent at a high level. So, high level in the sense that globally it's consistent. Statistically, it's okay, but at the level of the ISM, to characterize the ISM and most of the studies reported during this summer school, well, we don't have the information. So we have general results, general trends, which can be interpretable with models. But which models and what we can constrain efficiently is something which for me is very difficult to define.
And so there is a last questions by Anastasia Yarovova. It's a very practical questions. So you get some observational data. You already have difficulties to get it from, for instance, one line of IZ quasar and so on. And there are so many unknown. Can you do any model and without waiting for additional observations to constrain more? So said otherwise, you have observation, you know that there are plenty of things that are unknowns. How can you do the best of the modeling?
I don't know how to define the best. Well, if you don't have, well, your data are not so good and you don't have a lot of data, you have to use simple models. We go back to the idea of simple models. So you are using simple models, you are using average laws. Well, so at the end you have results, but you don't know if it is not biased, and your hypotheses are the best ones. But you must simplify for sure.
Okay, Gary, you want to say something?
Right. So, at least in my work, I try to keep in mind what's the purpose of the models. So, we're not trying to build an accurate scale model of precisely the system. We're trying to understand, or at least you're trying to answer a bigger question. So I would first say, to begin, an old rule of management, begin with the end in mind. What is it you're actually after? You want to measure the metallicity. You want to measure the star formation rate. You want to measure the heating. What's the heating source? What is it that's making the system active? So you're not going to ever be able to make a beautiful scale model of precisely what's going on there. Another way of putting it, I think with our tools, we can predict the climate, we can't predict the weather. And so if you're after the metallicity, or if you're after the star formation rate, you would then ask yourself what you can use the models as a guide to how the observations change if we make different assumptions about the metallicity or star formation rate. And it's a different approach. We're not trying to build, or I'm not trying to build an intricate scale model of precisely what's going on there. I don't think I can, given all the limitations we have in astronomy, but we can build kind of a model, not a simulation of the overall climate, of what is going on in the spectrum. I mean, so one of the things I've done over years is try to figure out how to get metallicities out of the quasar emission lines. And so you just try to find lots and lots of different models, find out what line ratios are sensitive to, and then try to find line ratios that are sensitive to metallicity, but not to anything else that you don't know. And it's possible to make progress that way. So I think it's the question of what is it do you want out of the models? So these details are, I don't know are gonna be possible given these uncertainties that are on the screen right now.
Okay, so maybe we could go to the next topic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So we already spoke a bit about it. Is we are when we have observations, up to which complexity should we go to in modeling this observation? So the first question. So it's simple to say that we need a simple model, but as has been said by Véronique, sometimes crucial things are missing and can completely bias your interpretation. So first question is, how do we know the right model of complexity for a given set of observations? Okay.
Maybe I can start if no one else wants. I think it's important to define clearly what is the complexity of a model, because for instance, from well, mathematically, for a model fitting point of view, the complexity would just be well, related to the number of free parameters, which is not the same as the complexity of the physical and chemical processes that have been included in the model. For instance, if I take PDR models, the way they are used most of the time, they have only 3 free parameters, which are the UV illumination, the density or thermal pressure of the gas, and some measure of the thickness of the slab that is modeled. And if you compare this with a Radex model, for instance, will also have 3 free parameters: a column density, and a temperature, but the complexity of the physics that's included in is not the same. So I think we have to be clear which kind of complexity we are discussing.
Yeah, exactly. But then I completely agree with what you said. Basically, for your PDR examples, you have density, temperature, and illumination. But in your lecture, you said that if you try to understand the observation of H2, you need to include many different physical processes, and if you're missing ones, you can misinterpret. So this gives the impression also that it's a never-ending story.
Yes, but I mean, we can only, for me at least, we can only go forward. I mean, removing complexity means that we are neglecting even more things. So we are even more likely to be biased in the results that we find.
I completely agree with Emric on this.
And so the fact is, in your modeling, when you're adding a new parameter, you're studying whether it's changed or not the outcome, and if it changes not so much the outcomes, does it happen that you don't consider it anymore afterwards?
It's always difficult because the range of conditions that can be found in different kind of environment is so large that quite often a process can be negligible in almost everywhere except in a specific range of conditions that might happen in some objects. So sometimes, yes, you include something and you see that across all reasonable parameter values, it's negligible, but very often it will be negligible in some regimes and important in other regimes.
So basically, you're saying that you need to be some kind of you need to know very well the models you're using to know how to turn the physical thing that may be crucial for some for the modeling of some source. That's what you're saying?
Well, usually you don't really need to turn off anything, at least when we, I mean, for instance, when we use PDR models, I mean, in some cases, some of the processes won't be very important, but it doesn't change the computation time by much to keep them.
Yeah, I think the idea is the opposite. You don't want to to turn the knob. You don't want to add or remove physical processes depending on the source. You want to have a model that is solid enough to be able to reproduce observations in a wide range of conditions without having to change the physics. And
I agree, but on the other hand, why using a PDR models to model UV shielded dark clouds?
Oh, no, okay, of course. I mean, if you're using a model PDR to model something that is not a PDR, then yes, there is a problem. But that's not that's the question of how using the right model.
If you want.
Not the right model complexity for a given.
Okay.
So I think indeed, it's, as you said, it's very important to know the physics that's included or not in the models that you are using. Otherwise, indeed, if you apply a model to an environment where the assumptions of the model are not consistent, for instance, in a dark cloud where you might have time-dependent effects for the chemistry, and if you use a stationary PDR model, of course, you will miss those.
Or you may use a PDR model to model something that is maybe much simpler because there is absolutely no far UV radiation or very little, and yeah, you can maybe save time, but yeah, so it's a different question than the right level of model complexity. I agree with Enrique. If you are, that's meets again from the previous slide. If you are missing an important process, you may have a strong bias in your predictions. So you want to include all the processes that could have a strong effect on the predictions. And even if it's only in some environments, because you don't know a priori, unless you know in advance that, okay, this is going to be completely negligible, maybe you want to switch it off, but to go faster, but it's always a bit dangerous, I guess.
So let's group the two next questions. How to disentangle the degeneracy between physical parameters, or physicals in the broad sense, chemical, physical, and so on. And do more observation brings more constraints or just more complexity? Anyone want to start? So we can give examples of degeneracy between physical parameters when you're doing, Gary, sorry.
Often many observations will simplify things because, again, we're trying to get the climate, not the weather, at least in my work. And if you're looking at one object, you don't know if there's a 3 sigma outlier. Whereas if you have a family of objects, you can see what the trend is. You can see what the mean is. And so computer models are much more likely to get an ensemble average right than to get one idiosyncratic escapee from the lunatic den that happens to be passing by. So I vastly prefer and have more success in working with large ensembles of observations where you can see the trends and you can see the scatter away from the trends, and you can also see the trends. We can get the climate with models, we can't get the weather, I don't think.
So what happens when for instance, when you're doing radiative transfer and you have degeneracy between density and temperature? How to tackle those kind of problems?
If you're doing the physics wrong, you don't need to do anything. You may as well go to the beach.
This I agree, but that's another question. So I agree that if the physics can be right, and you can still have degeneracy between parameters. No.
That's where actually more observations are important. I think to break the degeneracy, you want to use, for example, different species with different critical densities. So then the degeneracy will be probably lifted because some of them will be in RT, but not others. You can use spatial information if you have access to that. Gives you also constraint on the size of the emission, or you can use, again, velocity information. I mean, you need to use, to multiply the kind of constraints. Orthopower ratio in shocks, for example, can help you also lift degeneracy between different shock models because the orthopower ratio behaves differently in different shocks.
So do the fact that now the observatory gives more and more observation at the same time because we are going broadband in frequency or wavelengths and so on, multi-wavelengths, is it really important for?
I mean, I would say yes, clearly. The fact that again, I'm taking the example of this Hexos Orion survey. Clearly, having a full spectral survey by Herschel helped a lot to disentangle different regions and to pinpoint the physical parameters of each region, because you had lines from different upper energies, different molecules with different critical densities. You had different chemical tracers, and all of that together really constrains the models much more. Of course, they may, in the end, if you don't manage to fit all these constraints with your model, it's going to bring more complexity because you will need to modify your model and make it more realistic. But as a first step, it's going to help you narrow down leave the degeneracy. In the end, maybe you find zero solution instead of an infinity of solution that you had before. You go into the opposite situation of zero solutions, which means that your model is just too simplistic and you need to add the processes, but that's progress.
So I guess this is the same. That's what you said in your lecture, Karine. That the more observable you have, the easiest to disentangle the.
It will help to lift degeneracies, but it also bring more complexity to the model. The feeling I have now is that. Now that we can fit or consider polarization in absorption and emission, dust models are changing quite a lot, and I think it won't be easy for them to reproduce all these constraints.
But it means that they are getting more realistic.
Yes, probably. Yeah.
It's
so really it brings more constraints means, I think, more complexity for the grain models, because of polarization, you need to stop working with spherical grains. And then you have the question of the size, the shape. What shape do you adopt? You can have any shape. You can think of shape distributions and have many. So you have to find some simple way to describe your non-spherical grains. Are they just non-spherical, or are they aggregates? So it's also new free parameters.
What was striking in your lecture is that you've shown how much we know about the structure of those grains, okay, and not only distribution of size, but kinds of grains, whether they're ionized and so on. So there are plenty of there must be plenty of observables that help you to know all this.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
May I say something?
Yes,
of course.
Well, if the talk had been given by someone else, I'm sure you would have, which would have been presented differently. You know what I mean? For instance, Karine, if the talk was given by Anthony Jones, I'm sure that where you showed the ionized pHs, it would have shown different size distribution for amorphous hydrocarbons. So,
so you're saying that this is one view of one interpretation,
yes,
and you still have degeneracy. Okay.
Yes,
yes,
depending
yes.
on what you are using for two model scenes.
So you're less optimistic.
No, but there are things we know for sure, and there are things which are still debated.
Yeah, but this question of pHs versus amorphous carbon grains, I mean, when I start working in astrophysics, the question was there and was very, very debated, and it's still there 25 years later.
Yeah, that was an easy one. Huh? So.
Véronique, do you want to comment on having more observables from galaxies?
Oh, yeah, I agree with what was said. I would say that, yes, of course, it brings both more constraints and more complexity. And when you are working on galaxies, well, dust is only one component. So you need to have, well, a large wavelength range from the UV to the submillimeter, and even well, from the X-ray to, to the radio emission, in order to also to add all the components you need to understand the full emission of a galaxy. And because you have also some overlaps of all these different emissions. So of course you need a data to have more constraints, but most of the time, practically, people are using more complex models when they have few more data, and sometimes it's not completely justified. And for example, what is quite commonly used now for studies of galaxies on a statistical point of view is to use statistical diagnostics, just like Bayes factors or information by BIC or IFC, ACAC information criteria or Bayesian information criteria, to at the end decide if you need more parameters or not. It's also linked to the degeneracy of not only physical parameters, but parameters for models. So it's something which is debated also in this way. Okay, you can add complexity when you have more data, but is it useful, and can you get at the end more information, or are you only better on the models that you already have? So it's not so easy to decide what to do. And if you need one more component, or if you have to put more parameters in your dust emission, for example, you add another parameter. So sometimes it's obvious when you open a new wavelength range. For sure, you need to add something to your model, but sometimes it's not the case. So you must be cautious in adding constraints or complexity, because at the end, if you add complexity, you don't add a lot of constraints, because most of the time you don't constrain the new complexity. So it's a compromise.
Yeah, so you're saying basically that we could make more use of information theory that give us tools to know which amount of information we can extract from
exactly
data.
Yes, what is is it justified to add complexity or not on a statistical point of view? So yeah.
Aymeric, any comment on this?
No, but I think here we are again talking about complexity in terms of well, related to free parameters.
Yes, not physical parameters, yes, for sure. Because if you know that you need physics, you need physics.
Yes,
but it's not the case for,
what I mean is that some adding some physical processes in a model do not necessarily mean adding more free parameters. For instance, in a PDR model, you can add new chemical pathways. It won't change the numbers of free parameters.
Okay, so
I can add something about free parameters. It's very difficult to define a free parameter because when you add parameters to models, they are not necessarily free parameters, or because most of the times they are linked to other parameters. So you don't add a new completely free parameter because of course it is constrained by other part of the spectrum and other fits. So well, statistically it's complicated.
Yes, yes.
Even the idea of free parameter.
Yeah, it's always a choice of the modeler which parameters are considered as free and which are fixed to some
but you have statistical
value.
tools to get some constraint on the number of free parameters and what you can add, and
yes,
it's something I think we have to consider.
Yeah, it's again totally agree with Aymeric that we really need to distinguish complexity, physics, free parameters, and for example, in the example of the grains that Karine was mentioning, you make the grains non-spherical, but it's still the same physics. So you're adding a free parameter. Then I guess the question is more perhaps if we need to add either to modify the physics or to add a new parameter, new free parameter, what do we learn? I mean, because we want to fit observations to learn something. And I think that's the question that was brought up earlier. How does that change the answer to the question that we have to get a better fit? Does it significantly change the best fit? Or, I mean, the values of the parameters we're interested in? Let's say before you had a best fit for some density and you add a new parameter that improves the fit, but does it change the value of density that you infer? Or is it just a better fit because you've added one more free parameter? And I think that these are questions that we have to look at very carefully. When we add a new parameter, how does it change the values of the main parameters we're interested in?
So let's conclude this part with I will change slightly the question because I think it has already been said that modeling of foregrounds will be required for current and is already required for current and will be even more for future cosmological experiments. And so of course this is an opportunity, but the question is, are we well equipped to do this? Yes, this already, or should we make a particular effort in trying to do this? Your hand is raised, Sylvie, but is it?
Oh, sorry.
It's from the previous.
I can say that for foreground characterization, what will be crucial will be our ability to reproduce the polarization observation, the polarized emission. And for the moment, it's not really, it's starting to be taken into account in those models. So I think there is some work for dust model to be able to reproduce and to
So, but
give
then-
a robust proposition of a dust model that can account for polarized emission.
But then to continue on what Emeric and Sylvie said, if I understand what you're saying is, it's not just a question of quantity, it's also maybe a question of physics, that additional physics that may be missing on the magnetic field and in its interaction with dust.
Yes, that's probably. It's also the physics of the grain. But you have two different kind of models and two different philosophy in cosmic dust model. You have the one that just take the observation and say, okay, this observation is representative, and so I will use it as a template of cosmic dust model. And then you have other models that puts real grain material analogs, and it's not the same problematic, because in this case you will have what analogs are the most representative, and why should choose this one instead of another. But both kind of model, I think, will agree and will be able to reproduce quite well the observation at the end. So there is a degeneracy between dust model, in fact. I think they all do a reasonable good job. But then, yeah, for polarized emission, you have the problem of the physics of grain alignment and everything.
So Guylaine just is on. Do you want to comment on the modeling of foregrounds? It's not foreseen, but maybe she's okay. I don't see any more Nathalie. Are you still on, Nathalie, for questions? No, maybe she has been logged out. So there is one remark by Marjorie Declercq. Are the current DOTS model updated, adjusted when new observations are obtained, or are the models rather static and new models appear whenever new observations appear?
They are not static. New models are developed when you have new observational constraints. It takes a while to adjust all the parameters when you have a new set of observational model. But probably the best example are the drain models. There is like probably between 5 and 10 different models from the 80s, when he first proposed this famous drain model, and then he adapted it every couple of years to take into account the flattening of the emissivity in the far infrared, some new X-ray constraint on the observation. And now you have this very new model, which is quite different from the others, that was published this year. And the Themis model also, there will be a new version. So
it's important to stay tuned and to follow the update of the models.
Yes, it's better to use the new one and not the Drain-NME 84, for sure.
Okay, let's continue. We still have 15 minutes. So it should be Nathalie, but I will continue unless she gets back. So we thought about...
Sorry, I'm back.
Okay.
On my phone, but I'm back. Yes. So the next question was about laboratory astrophysics. So it's a bit provocative. Do we need laboratory astrophysics to understand interstellar medium and intergalactic medium? And is it any useful for extragalactic studies? And particularly ISE studies?
Well, I think for ISM, the answer is clear, yes. For ISE study, honestly, there may be peculiar problem, or it's environment that are so different than the one we study in the ISM that it could be interesting to wonder what kind of dust or chemical reaction we have in such environment, which are clearly different from from our own ISM.
But can you elaborate a bit, Karine? Why is it important to get laboratory astrophysics for ISM?
Well, to understand the physics and the chemistry that is going on. We were speaking about very detailed PDR models with a lot of physics and chemistry and with a lot of reaction rates. And so you need to know what are the most important reaction and to measure at best the reaction rate and as accurately as possible and in environmental condition as close as possible as the one you'll find in ISM. So laboratory astrophysics, experimental work and calculation are I think, very important ingredients of all these models.
Yeah. And Gary wanted to add something. So please, Gary.
Laboratory astrophysics is critical because what we're all up against is the many-body Schrödinger equation. In the case of molecules, there's many bodies. And so it's very, very challenging to solve that numerically. In the case of complex chemistry, you don't even try probably. So it has to be driven by experiments. There's a lot of problems with experiments. I can tell you what's wrong with laboratory astrophysics. The first thing is it's very expensive. And so there has to be a funding coming in, and it has to be sustained funding despite the fact that it's very, very low impact. It's very low impact because what happens to a person in laboratory astrophysics is they'll publish a rate. After several years of work, it gets gobbled up by a code. Cloudy gets a lot of citations. The poor people who actually did the basic data get none of that. They get one citation from Cloudy. And at the end of the day, they've used up a lot of resources. They put a huge amount of human effort. They've gotten a handful of citations. I know a lot of laboratory astrophysicists. And what they end up doing, if you've got a lab set up, well, why am I doing this? This is a lot of hard work. I can do industrial chemistry. There's a lot of things I can do that will be much more rewarding. It's less work than this. It's important it's critical if you want to really understand it, because you can't solve the many-body Schrödinger equation. In the case of chemistry, the many-body Schrödinger equation, you can't do it rigorously like you can, say, one electron hydrogen. So it's going to come down to measurements. The measurements are difficult. The measurements that were easy were all done 50 or 100 years ago. The measurements that are not lab data that are missing today are hard. They're challenging. That's why they've not been done yet. And so it's hard to know what the answer is. It is important to think about the fact that the American astronomical community and the whole physics community put millions and millions of dollars into this. It was called the Joint Institute for Laboratory Astrophysics, JILA. And so it was founded. They hired a very famous astronomer, Gamow, to lead it. It was probably healthy for about 5 or 10 years. It very quickly lost its way because of the problems I just mentioned. I know some of the people who were there back a long time ago. Of course, they're gone now. So they built a huge building in a very beautiful place in Boulder. They brought together 100 or so people to work on this. They had serious funding from what was then called the National Bureau of Standards, now called Institute of Standards Technology. And they completely lost their way within 10 years. So it's hard to know. It's easy to know that it's critical. It's hard to know with humans and the way we are, how it is you're going to accomplish it.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. Do we have someone else who want to add something about this?
Yeah, well, I agree that we need it. because at least for sharks, there are many processes that involve grains, and, for example, or chemical rates, and even if there are some estimates of chemical rates, it's always better to have an experimental confirmation. And for the grains, for example, the sputtering of grains of ice mantles is very important in sharks to predict the emission in many species that are enhanced in sharks. So if we don't know well, for example, the binding energies of these ices, or even the composition of these ices, actually that we need to input, it has a huge effect on the outcome. So we need laboratory astrophysics to narrow down and to reduce the uncertainties on several of the microprocesses that are involved in these models.
So there is no comments or questions. Yes, there is one maybe by Frederick.
Yeah.
Exploring, I'm not sure exactly what he means, but he says exploring 3 parameters is even more expensive experimentally than numerically.
Right, no, it's in every sense possible, no? In time and in money, and no.
Yes, I mean, that's what I meant, is that it's easy to explore, a range of parameters with a code, but with an experiment, it means, I mean, a lot of things that you are going to, I mean, all the consumable that you need to run the experiment.
Yeah, well, that's the point. It's expensive, but it's also, you cannot explore any parameter. You have some experimental limitation also.
By the way, there is a question by Marjorie Declerc on the Slack, and she asks, can all the ISM conditions, temperature, density, etc., be mimicked in the lab?
Yeah, temperature, yes. Density, no. The best vacuum in our experiments are much higher than the ISM, but still, it's a good approximation. So we can do a lot of things. Now, manipulating some species can be very complicated. If you want to study a large pH in the gas phase at 10K and submit it to gas and ions, you need a big experiment to trap your ions, and you cannot do everything. You're limited by your sample, by your technique of analysis and everything. So this is why experiments are very important, also in combination with numerical simulation also.
Okay, so maybe we can move to the next point.
Well, we only have 10 more minutes, so there has been, I think, we could discuss a bit about this point.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
That has not been yet discussed, I think, in this roundtable. And in fact, there is a comment that is related in the Slack to this one. So the question is, we know that when along the line of sight, due to being to limited resolution of your observations, even in the galaxy, it's even more difficult in extragalactic, but even in the galaxy, you're mixing some different phenomenon into a given observation. It's difficult to have something that is completely pure. And so we've seen that we have complex, extremely precise models of dust, of shocks, of PDR, of H2 regions. But in fact, in particular for nearby galaxies, all this is mixed inside a single beam. And so the question is whether the next generation of models in DSM will need to be a cooperation between models to get a better modeling and how to get this. And a related question is some models are not public in the sense that they are not on GitHub or not available. The source codes are not available and so on. And why is this? And shall we go out of this? So is it needed, the fact to have models that cooperate, or?
Gary raised his hand, Jérôme.
Ah, okay, Gary.
I want to say two things, maybe slightly unrelated. Firstly, you mentioned GitHub. So we got kicked off our server, Cloudy, and looked for a place that would hopefully be free for an open source code. There's no such place. GitHub would not support a project as big as Cloudy and with as many downloads as Cloudy gets in a year. And so you have to go to a commercial service. So we have found temporary commercial service, but there is no long-term home. GitHub is fine. Free GitHub is fine if you have a real super lightweight project, but there's no place to park something like Cloudy. And so that means I'm 70 years old. So where's Cloudy going to be in 5 years? Gone is where it will be. And there is no place to park big codes with big footprints with lots and lots of downloads. So that's just, you just mentioned this, you mentioned GitHub, and that set me off there. There is no place at NASA or NSF or the other things that have funded the code for many decades to park it in a safe place. So the last thing I want to say about, lots of things in complexity, if you get a very complex environment, it becomes simple again, because then you go over to the ensemble average. And so we've done a large number of quasar models where we've just said, we don't actually, you just imagine a full range of parameters in the beam. And so there's many, you look at a quasar, there's a lot of things in the beam. And so you can, in the simplest case, you just have one cloud, one set of parameters. And then in an intermediate case, you're probably sunk. In the asymptotically complex case, it gets simple again, because then you have an ensemble average, and you can do that in the computer. You can find you end up with distribution functions for the cloud properties, and then the free parameter becomes something with the distribution function.
Yeah, it's very striking that I don't know what's the situation for you nice guys, but it's very striking for PDR models. 20 or 30 years ago, there was 10 or 20 models, and now there are only 3 that are actively developed. I think this is what you said, Emmerich. And so I'm surprised by this, because those models are more and more used to do the analysis, but they depend on less and less people.
So it's
worse. It's worse than that. We're all pretty old. So in the ionized gas, there's Cloudy, me. There's Tim Coleman with XStar. He's my age. There's Dopida with mappings. He's dead. So what's going to be left in 5 years?
So we need to encourage young people to take over.
Well, no, the astronomy has moved on. Astronomy has moved away from that kind of doing physics, and it's moved to a new generation that's doing big data. And that's where the future is, things like Sloan and LSST. And so just this avalanche of data. And so that kind of work is challenging. Nobody, okay, put it a different way. My university would not hire a young Gary Ferland.
Okay, I understand this, but is the need, do you consider that the need is not there anymore, or that the need is still there?
Well, I know that I won't need it in 5-10 years.
Yeah,
I won't be here anymore.
That's not
Sorry,
exactly the answer I was searching for, but Emric?
No, I just wanted to say, yeah, for PDR models, it's a bit more than 3, but I think indeed the problem is that those kinds of models, developing them and maintaining them and updating them is a long-term project. And the rhythm of publication and the need to publish fast and is less and less, maybe less and less compatible with this kind of long-term development.
Just to mention, I don't know anything about the internal politics of France, but Madone for many years was a world leader in this. They had, of course, the famous Madone code, PDR code. They had Susie Collin in that very large group who I think, and then differently was Pequigno. So they had a large community of people doing this. I'm not sure what's in Madone today, but there was a sustained effort focus there, but certainly during the 80s.
No, I think in France there is still the idea that those kind of models need support, but there still is a question of competition with new subjects that emerge, like imaging black holes, horizon of black holes, gravitational waves, and stuff like that. So it's a difficult balance.
And one observation is that I mean, over the years, we've seen new PDR models appearing, but most often they disappear after a few years because the person that developed it moved on to something else.
Okay, Natalie, shall we close here?
Well, probably, if we want to start the hands-on session on time and leave some time for our attendees to rest. I think that was already quite a dense discussion.
Yeah. Thank everyone. Thanks all the speaker, and thank also for the attendees for their comments and questions. That was useful. I liked very much this roundtable.
Thank you, and don't hesitate to go on with the discussions on the Slack channel.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
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 Bye.